Let's see if we can begin. On behalf of the John F. Kennedy School of Government, as Dean, I want to welcome you to the panel this evening. Fortunately, we have two moderators, so we don't need a third one. So let me introduce Professors Dorfman and Friedman, who will, between them, moderate and tell us what we're doing. Professor Dorfman or Friedman?
I'm Dorfman. Just 50 years ago this month, our banking system went through the most traumatic experience in its whole history. During it, every bank in the country closed. Not a check could be cashed. Rich men worried about making their dimes last. Ordinary people, even those with jobs, didn't have any dimes to worry about. In the end, the system was saved, and we have been fortunate enough to inherit it. It seems to me that the least we can do on the semi-centennial of that crisis is to remember that such a thing can happen and that a successful outcome is not guaranteed. In that spirit of sober gratitude, I want to take a hasty few minutes to recall what happened during the banking crisis of 1933. The accepted date for the onset is St. Valentine's Day of 1933. Just as with every earthquake, there had been premonitory tremblers. Bank failures, which banking experts tactfully call suspensions, were abnormally high in the last quarter of '82. There was a series of runs on the banks in Nevada that led to the first of the state bank holidays in October. Then Iowa had the same experience in January, but those people thought were specialized local problems. The thermometer that I'm going to use to indicate the nationwide state of confidence in the banks is the currency in the hands of the public. And that rose by $44 million in the week ending in February 4th. $44 million sounds piddling, but remember, the 1933 dollar was about 7 times as large as the 1983 dollar, and the economy was about as quarter as large in all its dimensions. So to appreciate what any of such figures mean, you should multiply by a factor of at least 10. And all the numbers that I'm going to quote to you tonight have been properly inflated in that spirit. So, in the adjusted scale, February began with domestic withdrawals from banks of about 440 million, and Louisiana declared a bank holiday. The next week, currency outstanding rose by 530 million, and the following week, withdrawals doubled to 1.3 billion. Now we come to the onset. There was one of the smaller banks in Detroit that had been suffering heavy withdrawals from the beginning of January. The bankers there were making desperate efforts to merge it with some other bank. No takers. Then they tried to borrow enough money to carry it through, but the bank didn't have any collateral to speak of. And by February 13th, it was clear that the bank was going to have to close its doors in a few days. The Clearinghouse Association feared that this would touch off a general run and appealed to the governor to declare a bank holiday. He did, shortly after midnight on the morning of February 14th. The first that the general public heard that their banks were in trouble was when they read the headlines in the morning's paper. How'd they react? Well, inevitably there were reporters conducting sidewalk interviews, and one man in the street responded, quote, "Now we are all in it together." And that seems to have been the spirit. No panic, no resentment, and even a note of relief that the vaguely feared disaster had become actual and could be measured. The day after the bank holiday was declared in Michigan, a would-be assassin fired 4 shots at the president-elected. Missed him, but he wounded 4 other people, including the mayor of Chicago. The day after that, the diplomatic crisis over the invasion of Manchukuo reached a climax. And after that, people got increasingly absorbed in who was going to be appointed to the next cabinet. The banking crisis disappeared from the headlines, but it didn't disappear. While attention was being distracted, disaster was coming into sight. That week, currency withdrawals from the bank rose to $1.8 billion. All over the country, state legislatures were frantically passing enabling legislation to prepare the way for bank holidays. And the day that the Maryland legislature passed its law, the banks were closed. And finally came the massive hemorrhage in the week ending March the 4th. About $8 billion was withdrawn from the banks, modern scale. That was more than they could stand. On Tuesday of that week, 3 states declared holidays. On Wednesday, 5, on Thursday, 7, on Friday, 7 more. And effective Saturday morning, a working day in those ancient times, all the other states closed their banks. The New York Fed was closed. The New York Stock Exchange and all the security exchanges in the country. The banking and financial system had come to a dead halt. At noon on that day, the new president stood on the inaugural platform in front of the Capitol and uttered one of his best-remembered sentences. I firmly believe that we have nothing to fear but fear itself. It was excellent rhetoric, and it turned out to be true. 2 days later, he proclaimed the only national banking holiday in our history. It was a symbolic gesture. All the banks were firmly shut and had been for several days. But the gesture was important. It symbolized that we were all in it together and that there was a firm hand at the tiller. 9 days later, the banks were open again. More accurately, about 2/3 of them reopened, holding about 90% of all deposits. The money started to flow back into the banks, about $3 billion the first week, and then increasing. A cold-blooded auditor going over the assets and the liabilities of the banks would not have seen much change from 2 weeks before. But something had changed that the auditor didn't notice. It was fear that had closed the banks. But once they had closed, once we were all in it together, once the dreaded unknown was known, then there was an underlying confidence that seems to have driven out the fear, just as Roosevelt had foretold. We economists are reluctant to admit that economic events are at the mercy of mass emotion. There's no room for that in our models. Yet that is what closed the banks the first week of March and reopened them 2 weeks later. Throughout it all, as the man in the street suggested that very first day, the underlying confidence never faltered, and for that we must be grateful to all those people. And now I have great pleasure in turning the meeting over to our permanent distinguished moderator who does not remember the bank holiday It was 1933. Professor Friedman.
Dorfman drew the satisfying task of doing some historical research and telling you what he found. I drew the nasty guy's task of keeping all our speakers on time. I will do my best to do that. Our first speaker is John Kenneth Galbraith, whom I assume is known to all of you. Professor Galbraith is the Warburg Professor of Economics Emeritus at Harvard. He has had a long and distinguished career both in academia and also in public service, including his service as Deputy Administrator of the Office of Price Administration in the early 1940s, from which position he principally organized the wartime system of price control, and also as Ambassador to India in the early 1960s. He has been a prolific writer, including such books as The Affluent Society, The New Industrial State, and most recently his memoir, A Life in Our Times. The reason why he is especially appropriate to address us this evening, however, has to do less with these more recent works than with his book entitled The Great Crash, in which he revealed his predilection to enormous respect for banks and bankers. And I thought that as a prelude to his own remarks, it would be useful to recall what he said in his book on the crash. I quote, "Above all, it is evident that the capacity of the financial community for ignoring evidence of accumulating trouble, even of wishing devoutly that it might go unmentioned, is as great as ever. This deserves a special word. Even in such a time of madness as the late 1920s, a great many men in Wall Street remained quite sane, but they also remained very quiet. The sense of responsibility in the financial community for the community as a whole is not small. It is nearly nil. Perhaps this is inherent. In a community where the primary concern is making money, one of the necessary rules is to live and let live. To speak out against madness may be to ruin those who have succumbed to it. So the wise in Wall Street are nearly always silent. The foolish thus have the field to themselves. None rebukes them." End of quote. Well, that was a distressing thought, and so I thought it would be useful if Professor Galbraith now can take the floor and rebuke them in person. Ken?
Well, my special qualification tonight is, as the author of this book, which I hope you will all search out now. I had many years ago a lesson in how one promotes one's own books. It was briefly recognized on the bestseller list, and this has an enormously bad effect on anyone's character, even one as good as mine. And coming through the old LaGuardia terminal one night after it had been published, I stopped to see if it was on sale, and of course it wasn't, and I went in, and I stood around until the lady could no longer ignore me. And she said, "Are you looking for something?" And finally I got my courage up and I said, "Yes, I'm looking for a book. I've kind of forgotten the author's name, something like Galbraith." And then I decided I must be stronger, so I said, "But I remember the title, The Great Crash." And she said to me, in a rather pitying tone, "That's not a book you could sell in an airport." My distinction this evening, not shared by Professor Dorfman completely, is that I'm the only one in this vast audience who was there. Therefore, I'm the only one whose remarks are utterly reliable. My task is to suggest in my few minutes some comparisons, some parallels and some contrasts between these present years and those of 50 years ago. There are some obvious differences. The Great Depression followed a period of extreme speculation, particularly in the securities markets, and the crash of 1929. I share with Professor Kindleberger the view that this was not an insignificant thing, that it in turn had a shattering effect on consumer buying, business investment, effects far beyond beyond Wall Street and beyond the circumstance itself. We've had nothing of that sort in these last years. The industrial structure that was left us in the 1920s was also very weak. This had followed a period where there had been a multiplication of the great investment trusts and the holding companies, and this had been done under the guise of a model which is still not forgotten and not ignored, that if something happens in the field of industrial structure, it reflects the basic charm, dynamic of free enterprise and must be good. And we discovered in the early 30s that that is not so, and that there were grievous weaknesses in the industrial structure. Perhaps we should worry more about the takeover frenzy that we have had in these last years. Perhaps we should think more of the move to the conglomerates, should be more skeptical of the validity of that development than we have been. But again, I think one is safe in saying that the comparisons are not close. My old preoccupation with agriculture, I think there are comparisons. We entered the 1930s with a heavily indebted agriculture following speculation in land values, agriculture that was technically insolvent if you compared asset values and debts. And something of that same sort is true at the present time. But of course, with the difference that agriculture was then a very large part of the economy and has now shrunk into almost insignificance. Well, not quite. We still have to eat. I pass over one of the great changes that occurred as the result of what we now, I think, rightly call the Roosevelt Revolution, and that is the structure of social insurance, social security, concern in general for the deprived, the unfortunate, which did not exist 50 years ago. An apparatus for supporting incomes, which incidentally extends to agriculture, which was scarcely thought of at that time, and which in turn sustains the flow of purchasing power and above all, and more important, sustains a humanitarian base, an alternative to suffering, which, if by far from perfect, far from good, is still far better than anything of 50 years ago. Are there any parallels? I should think if I had to mention a parallel, one that Ben Friedman has already charged me to suggest, I would say that it was indeed in the area of the financial institutions and banking. The 1930s were the aftermath of a period of extreme mismanagement, extreme incompetence in the management handling of the banking structure, something that was particularly evident in the management and the direction of the great New York banks. National City Bank, as it then was headed by one Charles Mitchell, who could best and rather briefly be described as a fool. And the Chase was headed by Albert Wiggin, who by modern standards of law enforcement would not be a crook, but he would be called deeply self-concerned. He, after the crash, it was evident that he was deeply involved himself in the stock of the Chase National Bank. And he argued with some vehemence before a congressional committee that this was valid because it gave him an interest in the performance of the bank. His argument was a little weakened when it was made evident that he was massively short in the stock of the Chase National Bank, as it then was. In these last years, I've been forced to think, and particularly these last months, that things have not so much changed. We still have the lemming principle of banking, by which one banker rushes over the edge and all others follow. I hope that Governor Wallach will show us this evening the devices by which the Federal Reserve keeps track of that first lemming, that first person to move into Penn Central, or that first bank to move into Mexico. I'm aware of the fact that there were certain social advantages in the international lending of the 1920s, as there have been in these last years. I am reminded that in the countries that were recipient of the loans of these last years, there would have been earlier and serious trouble if that flow had not existed. This does not, however, charge those who are responsible with any great wisdom. Then, as now, of course, we have safeguards. In the 1930s, the Reconstruction Finance Corporation was brought into existence to repair the speculative damage and the insolvency that resulted from the excesses of the 1920s, as these were made worse by, of course, the circumstances of the Great Depression. We were rather more honest in those days in the way the banks were bailed out. It was a rather direct operation between Washington and New York, and there was no disguise involved. Indeed, there was a brilliant occasion when Charles G. Dawes, the head of the Reconstruction Finance Corporation, resigned one night, was in Chicago the next day, and was borrowing money for his bank from the Reconstruction Finance Corporation. He borrowed $90 million in old dollars for a bank that at the time had deposits of $95 million. We're now, and this is a great improvement, we now have the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation brought into existence over some conservative objection in those days, which eliminates totally the threat of the kind of panic runs which took Dawes out to Chicago. And we also, a really great development, and we also have the much more sophisticated device for bailing out the banks, by which governments make the money available to the International Monetary Fund. The International Monetary Fund makes the money available to the debtors. They, in turn, pay off the banks. And this, we, of course, all agree now, is a manifestation of free enterprise, uninhibited, uninstructed capitalism. There's also, this is my last comment, I think, some difference in the attitude toward the economy as a whole. I did not come here this evening to make a passionate speech on behalf of President Reagan and his economic advisors. I do think, however, that they have some advantage over those of Herbert Hoover and Calvin Coolidge, in that they have a far lesser commitment to the error of their ways, perhaps growing out of the fact that they have a more limited understanding of what they are doing. In consequence, we've had some retreat already from the extreme monetary astringency, which was the hallmark of the new administration when it came in, to the extent that my good friend Professor Friedman has said, and I find this enormously encouraging, that if this is monetarism, he is no longer a monetarist. Quite a wonderful and encouraging comment. And we have had the departure of the more primitive supply-siders from Washington, and it's hard to think of few people who are less mourned. The American Heritage Dictionary, to which I am an honorary advisor, a few months ago, a year ago, asked me for a definition of supply-side economics, and it was my singular pleasure to tell them that it wasn't needed, that in another year no one would wish to know. Thank you very much.
Whenever a problem arises, there is, of course, someone who makes it all okay. And we have with us this evening as our next speaker one of the people who make it okay, and that is Governor Henry Wallach of the Federal Reserve Board. Governor Wallach has a long and distinguished career as well, not only in the public service, but also in academic life, and even in the private sector. He began his career working in private business, including at the Chemical Bank in New York and also at a member firm of the New York Stock Exchange. He has also been at the Federal Reserve Bank of New York. He has been a member of the President's Council of Economic Advisors, and since 1974 has been one of the 7 governors of the Federal Reserve System of the United States. Now, governors of the Federal Reserve are, of course, very constrained in what they can say, especially on such matters relating to the activities of the Federal Reserve as the lender of last resort. But fortunately, in an unguarded moment some time ago, Governor Wallach did let us know what he really thought, and I'm pleased to quote from a recent memoir that he wrote entitled Some Misuses of Economics. And I quote, oh, I'm sorry, Henry, that was Some Uses of Economics, isn't it? I quote, as I view the world financial scene today, our greatest danger is not that of unstable exchange rates, but a repetition of what I observed as an 18-year-old when the world was financially frozen over, with international loans in default, currencies blocked, and the whole mechanism threatening to grind to a standstill. A fair job has been done so far in avoiding a repetition. I hope that when I leave this scene, it will not be in a financial ice age like that in which I entered it. Now, being a lender of last resort is a difficult job, and I think that it is always useful in economics to have assumptions, and so I want to quote one assumption from a book that I will come back to later, recently authored by another of our panelists, Charles Kindleberger, who starts a marvelous passage by saying, quote, assume, if you will, that the lender of last resort is not a witch doctor. With that assumption in mind, I'm very pleased to call on the only lender of last resort that we will hear from this evening as part of the main panel, Governor Henry Wallach of the Federal Reserve.
Thank you, Ben. Ladies and gentlemen, I don't know whether it was you, Ben, who placed me at the extreme left of this body, it is not really where I belong. I've listened with interest and some dismay to Ken Galbraith. Dismay because I thought he was going to make a fiery attack on our present misdeeds, and instead I've heard a reasoned and balanced comment with some indeed historical reflections. It's true things are looser in the world today than they were in earlier times. Was a stock market operator in the late 19th century who commented on the legal system of his day to the effect, he who sells what isn't his'n must buy it back or go to prison. In those days, contracts were sacred. Now, I quote this from hearsay. I didn't hear him say this personally, and I just wanted to mention that so that you don't think that everybody on this panel had first-hand information of 19th century finance. I have heard about the problems of our day, of course, more times than this, and the problems are real. It makes me think of the sad case of the three businessmen, a Frenchman, a Japanese, and an American, who were kidnapped by a gang of terrorists and were sentenced to be shot. But the terrorists were merciful. They gave each of them one last wish. So the Frenchman asked to be allowed to sing the Marseillaise. The Japanese asked to be allowed to give a lecture on Japanese management. The American asked to be shot first so we didn't have to hear another lecture on Japanese management. Well, I think the concerns about what is going on in the world today are real, but they are not of a kind that suggests a repetition of the 1930s. I feel tempted to go into a discussion of then and now as to what we learned at Harvard in the 30s and what I guess is being taught now by Professor Friedman and others. In the 1930s, you would not have referred to a lender of last resort. You would have known, and you'd better written it on your exam, that monetary policy was entirely ineffectual because of the enormous liquidity of the economy. This was after the crisis, when indeed there was a great lack of liquidity. And you would have, if you had absorbed all this, as I did at the time, spent many arduous years unlearning what you had learned, so that now you would come out with the conclusion that monetary policy indeed is all-powerful, and fiscal policy, which was then the hero of the picture, was lacking in power, and as somebody wrote, stranded on a $200 billion deficit today. All this suggests that the lemming theory of banking, which Ken Galbraith referred to as a characteristic of the late 20s and 30s, and probably appropriately, is not completely the case today. Besides, there are some very distinguished authorities who think differently of this. No less a philosopher than Voltaire, who knew something about bankers because of the liability side of his balance sheet. He said, if you see a Swiss banker jump out the window, jump after him, there's money to be made down there. Let me examine the anti-lemming aspects of our situation. Now, Ken Galbraith has mentioned one very important distinction. We have the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation. We also have the Federal Reserve as a lender of last resort. We have a kind of division of labor with the FDIC. It's not quite like the man who was selling peanuts in front of J.P. Morgan and Company and had a deal with them that he didn't make loans and they didn't sell peanuts. It is that we don't make loans to insolvent institutions. We make loans on good collateral to banks that are in liquidity trouble. When a bank gets into solvency trouble, that is to say its liabilities exceed its assets, then it becomes a case for the FDIC. You might say, is that a guarantee for all and every bank? Well, it is not, because the FDIC has a choice. It can allow a bank to fail but pay off depositors that have up to $100,000, or to pay off depositors up to $100,000. It can also, and usually does, choose to arrange a merger in which the bank is merged off and nobody loses any money. But that is not the absolute rule. We had the case of a bank recently, Penn Square, where the bank failed. I hope I would get the endorsement of Ken in that this is a wholesome lesson. They can't be promised to be always bailed out, and they have to have some degree of uncertainty, else one creates an incalculable moral risk. Now, apropos of bailing out, let me turn to the international side of the situation. You've probably seen that the IMF, International Monetary Fund, legislation has gone up to the Hill, and there'll be, has been and will be, testimony on this. And one of the points that has been made about it is this is a bailout for the banks. The banks have lent to countries that at the present time have a difficulty paying back, and now we're going to put $8.5 billion into the IMF so that the IMF can shore up the countries so they can keep the banks afloat. This, in the first instance, runs into the simple fact that the banks are not being bailed out, they're being bailed in. The IMF did something quite unprecedented. At the time it gave a loan to Mexico, it made it a condition of that loan that the banks would come in with $5 billion on top of what they already had there. Then, in the case of Brazil, we've seen an operation. Some banks had succeeded in getting their money out, which you might say is evidence of some alertness and skill. But it's not evidence of a statesmanlike attitude, because if everybody's trying to pile through the same keyhole at the same time, somebody, and probably more than just one, is going to be hurt. So the banks got together and they put much of the money that had been taken out back in order to stabilize the situation. So much for a bailout. Now, the countries themselves, have they wasted the money? Have they borrowed in excess? Well, you can use regression analysis to show that the investment ratio, in investment to GNP, rose as they increased their borrowing. That's not very complete evidence, but it shows that some positive use was made of the money. You can look at the rate of return on capital in these countries, and you'll see that it probably went down while all this borrowing went on. You can also see that their borrowings went up tremendously at the time of the second oil shock, which means that a lot of the money was spent for oil. So the picture is somewhat ambiguous. Does that mean that they can't repay? Let me say first, which I thought is obvious, but last night I gave a talk in which a lady challenged me angrily. I said, it's clear that a growing concern, whether it's the telephone company or a small business firm or a developing country, does not need to get out of debt. As it grows, its debt can grow if its investment grows and its ability to pay grows. This remark was not gracefully received, so I try it out on you. I think you'll find that very few businesses try to get out of the debt as they grow. The ability to carry debt advances as their income and sales advance, and if they don't use their debt capacity effectively, somebody will probably come and take them over and kick out the management and install a management that uses debt capacity more effectively. So I do not see the need for these countries to get out of debt. What I see is a need for them to pay back the debts they have on schedule while they incur new debts. And so they don't even roll over. They pay off completely one bank, they borrow from another, and that is essentially what growing enterprises do. So the size of the job of getting these countries to meet their obligations is not properly measured by the size of the debt. That debt may be repaid and the country may become a net capital exporter in the course of the decades, as the United States did. We moved from capital importer to capital exporter. That is not what is being asked of Brazil and of Mexico at this time. What is being asked that they make their economies viable again, reduce their current account deficit, reduce their budget deficit, reduce their inflation. If they do that, they'll be bankable, and the banking business will support them, and the banks will be right in doing so. If they don't, then indeed they will cut themselves off from credit, and it's not a question of the IMF imposing unfair conditions of them. You could never be worse off having some money, as from the IMF, than having no money at all. So on balance, the IMF always eases conditions in a country. But what is needed is a change in these policies, and a change in which the banks need to lend less than so far, the countries need to borrow less than so far. I think if we start on the present basis of debt and size of country, GNP of the country, growing about equally, that will be sustainable. The present crisis, which consists of many special factors, high interest rates, low commodity prices, oil shock, and so on, world recession, this crisis will be overcome, and the underlying solvency of the countries will show itself, provided they adopt the policies that are essential, whether they are imposed by the IMF or not. That is the situation as I see it now. Thank you.
Governor Wallach has now introduced the international dimension into the discussion, and our next panelist is well qualified to continue the discussion in that vein. As those of you who saw the poster for this panel know, one of our intended panelists had been John Hyman, formerly Comptroller of the Currency of the United States. John Hyman was unfortunately ill and not able to be with us tonight, and I'm very grateful to my colleague Richard Cooper for agreeing on very short notice to serve in his place. Richard Cooper is the Boas Professor of International Economics at Harvard, where he has arrived only recently after a lengthy career at the other place. Professor Cooper was not only Professor of Economics at Yale for over a decade, but also held the position of Provost of Yale University, a position which does not exist in our somewhat more feudal establishment. Professor Cooper has also served on 2 occasions in the State Department During the mid-1960s, he was the Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for International Monetary Affairs, and more recently, he was the Undersecretary of State for Economic Affairs for the entire 4 years of the Carter administration, a period when State Department officials apparently had somewhat more longevity than is currently the case. Now, Professor Cooper has also written extensively on these subjects, and I wanted to share with you just a few sentences from his well-known book on the economics of interdependence, and I think it fits here quite well. He said in that book that the argument is for easing the loads, but for simultaneously improving the capabilities, for restraining the growth of decision-making domains of banks and businesses, but for enlarging the jurisdictions of government in those areas of economic policy which bear most directly on international transactions. He then went on to say, recent plans for improving the international monetary system are mildly encouraging. If these reforms materialize and new forms of international liquidity are produced, the results will be beneficial even if the new liquidity is not well suited to the financing of prolonged payments deficits among industrial countries. For the deliberate process of creating international liquidity will bring together high officials from many nations to make decisions. Decision-making involves a more direct confrontation of conflicting national interests than does mere discussion, and it should cultivate a higher degree of responsibility toward the community of nations as a community and not merely as separate constituents. Richard Cooper.
I am not going to talk this evening about the 1930s. I learned all that I know about the great crash from reading Ken Galbraith and Charlie Kindleberger, and since both of them are here this evening, it would be not only superfluous but risky for me to venture into that domain. Furthermore, one can do a little more in 10 minutes, which is what I've been assigned about an hour and a half ago, than to convey an impression or a mood. It's not enough time for serious analysis, although one can convey the impression of serious analysis. And it's in that spirit that I will try to convey a point of view about our subject matter, an impression that is, in some respects, consonant with what a number of years ago Ken Galbraith very felicitously called the conventional wisdom, but in other respects I will deviate sharply from what is now the conventional wisdom. Now, the part of my observations that are consonant with the conventional wisdom is that we are now in a financial crisis of the first order, carrying the risks of a collapse in the manner of 1931 to 1933. I note that our introducer talked about 1933, but the process really began in Europe much earlier than that, in 1931. My own view is that we can avoid a collapse, but to do so will call for some very fast stepping by the Federal Reserve and by other central banks. We must try to prevent individual collapses. Those that occur must be isolated to keep them from spreading. And the Federal Reserve and other central banks must be prepared to break with precedent where necessary. I would, in fact, give the Fed high marks for the way it has performed in this area so far. It has been very skillful in limiting and isolating trouble spots. And I mention that now because later on I'm going to dump very heavily on the Federal Reserve in a different context. Now, in talking to various groups about this topic, I find myself two-faced. I try to calm bankers and the public and encourage them to stay with it. A steady course is what's necessary. Don't get too anxious. Don't pull the stopper. In short, I convey an attitude of complacency about the current situation. When I'm talking with central bankers or officials, in contrast, I try to convey a great sense of alarm and urgency in dealing with the situation, because I think we are in fact on the edge of a precipice in terms of the functioning of the international economy, and suggest that the officials and the central bankers, will have to be quick, wise, and flexible to keep us from going over the precipice. But, and here's the optimistic note, they have the power, they have the capacity to do so. If they are quick, wise, and flexible in their dealings with this, we are not caught in the grips of a process about which we can do nothing. Now, if we are in fact in the midst of a financial crisis bordering on collapse, everyone wonders, how did we get into this mess? And we're now engaging in that very human proclivity to find a scapegoat. And in this particular case, it's easy to find a scapegoat. Nobody likes big banks, and they're right in the middle of this. And therefore, we point to the big banks as the source of the current difficulties and dangers. If only they hadn't been so reckless, if only they hadn't been so imprudent, if they hadn't been so greedy, we wouldn't be talking about financial collapse, and even though the event may be improbable, even making analogies to the financial collapse of the 1930s. One could throw in the irresponsibility of some governments around the world for good measure, in addition to the banks. Now, it's here that I part company with the conventional wisdom. I think that this representation of how we got into the mess is a canard. I don't want to be misinterpreted. Of course there were some irresponsible governments in terms of the borrowing, and of course there were some careless loans made by aggressive loan officers on the make in terms of their career. But this is no more than normal. It happened in the mid-'70s, it happened in the early '70s, it happened in the mid-'60s. That's background noise, so to speak. It is not something that's peculiar to the late '70s and early 1980s. Seems to me that the major difference that we have now from those earlier periods is an enormous violation of expectations which were realistic at the time that the loans were made and the borrowings were undertaken. Nobody in 1979 or 1980 or even 1981 expected the recession, the world recession, to be as deep as it was, or the terms of trade to go so heavily against primary producers as the terms of trade have moved against primary producers, or real interest rates to be as high as real interest rates have in fact been in the last 24 months, 18 to 24 months. To take just one example, even as recently as 1 year ago, our local leading forecaster, DRI, was forecasting a rise in U.S. real GNP during the year 1982, fourth quarter of 81 to fourth quarter of 82, of 2%. This contrasts, and they forecast that the recession would bottom out and begin the upturn in the second quarter of 1982. This contrasts with the actual fall of GNP, fourth quarter of 81 to fourth quarter of 82, of 1.5%. DRI hedges its bets. It gives alternative forecasts, and it had an alternative forecast which it called deep recession. Now, this is 1 year ago. The deep recession forecast called for a fall in U.S. GNP of 1.1%, fourth quarter to fourth quarter, compared to the 1.5% that actually occurred, and that gave deep recession a probability of only 15%. Earlier forecasts, that was just 1 year ago, earlier forecasts were much more optimistic than that. Now, I cite these not to castigate DRI. On the contrary, they were representative of forecasters both in this country and in other countries, but rather to indicate the climate of expectations in which, or even a more optimistic climate of expectations, in which the loans of 1979 and 1980 and 1981 were actually made. And DRI, of course, was much more pessimistic than pronouncements by officials of the Reagan administration. Now, the expectations were violated, mainly in my view, because monetary policy was much tighter than anyone expected, or had reason to expect. And because fiscal policy outside the United States, the U.S. is an exception in this regard, was being tightened in all of the other major industrial countries except France. So the Federal Reserve, in my view, bears the proximate responsibility for the current state of affairs. Now, I do not want to suggest or imply that this was irresponsible behavior on the part of the Fed, although in my own view it was wrong-headed behavior. The Fed faced a very serious dilemma about how to fight inflation, and with their set of objectives, they pursued their objectives in the only way that they knew how, namely by tightening money excruciatingly. They faced a real dilemma, and for all I know, many of you in this audience shared their view that inflation had to be eliminated at any costs without really appreciating what the costs might be, what the consequences might be. Now, in the short time I have left, I could allocate to an elaboration of this theme, the dilemmas that face modern industrial economy, but I suspect that you prefer to hear about solutions to the mess that we are undeniably now in. And mine is this, that the Federal Reserve should, starting from now, pursue a steady expansionist course, much as in fact they have been doing over the last 6 months or so, without worrying too much about M1 or indeed any other particular measure of the money supply. M1 is especially meaningless at the present time. The government, the executive branch of the U.S. administration, should, on its part, reduce future, but not current, that is fiscal year 1983, deficits. The large fiscal 83 deficit is actually helpful at the present time, and the one element that we have that suggests that the expansion may continue. Now, that part of my prescription is at least almost conventional wisdom. It's close to the current conventional wisdom. But in addition to that, I would, and this starts from what is becoming the conventional wisdom, I would do nothing dramatic about the external debt problem. It seems to me that the path that we are now on, although troublesome, is probably the least risky path that we could be on. There have been many proposals for funding the LDC debt in some way, taking it into the World Bank or some new institution and so forth. You see these proposals almost daily, almost weekly in the Wall Street Journal or the New York Times or the Business Week or whatever. All of these schemes, directly or indirectly, put the burden of this large debt around the world on the taxpayers of the industrial countries. Now, I have no doubt that if we had a magic wand in the fashion of a child's fairy story, and we could add, by waving that wand, 5 years maturity to the debts of all the developing countries in the world, not only would the debtors be better off, but the creditors, in fact, would be better off as well. But we have no such magic wand. The only way to fund the debt at one stroke is through legislation. And I worry greatly about the process of putting any such arrangements as have been proposed into place. An acrimonious and prolonged public debate over exactly who was responsible for exactly what errors and what imprudence would occur. And in the meantime, lending by the banks would come to a halt while banks waited to see what new legislation would emerge from this process. And that new lending coming to a halt might generate the collapse which we all wish to avoid. It is far better, I think, to stick with the present process, which goes something like this. A country that is in serious debt trouble goes to its leading creditors and says it would like to reschedule. A rescheduling is then held under the auspices, for historical reasons only, of the French Ministry of Finance. It's called the Paris Club. A formula is worked out for rescheduling official and officially guaranteed debt in the context of a program worked out between the International Monetary Fund and the debtor country in question. The formula that's worked out for the reschedulings of official and officially guaranteed debt then sets the pattern for rescheduling the strictly private debt, where the creditors are private, strictly private. The debtors are usually governments or government agencies. This process will, in fact, although it's far less striking than a wave of a magic wand, which adds maturity, nonetheless does piecemeal add maturity, and usually with grace periods, to the debts of countries that are in serious trouble. And that seems to me a desirable process in the current circumstances. Of course, if the IMF is to play this role, it must have enough resources to put in its 2 bits worth to every bit of new credit that goes into the debtor country. And for that reason, I think that the legislation, which is now before Congress to increase the quotas of the IMF, deserves very strong support. As Henry Wallach has already observed, this process does not involve a bailout of the banks. On the contrary, not only must the banks reschedule existing debts and postpone, sometimes foregoing several years during the grace period of any repayment of principal, postpone the repayment of principal, but part of the deal is that they have to lend more, put pejoratively, pour good money after bad, as I would put it, pour good money.
Our final panelist, before we turn to some discussion and questions from the floor, is also, I would think, well known to most people here, Professor Charles Kindleberger, Ford Professor of Economics Emeritus from the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. Professor Kindleberger, in addition to his academic career, has also had a number of public service assignments, beginning with the work in the financial world at the Federal Reserve Bank of New York, also at the Bank for International Settlements, also at the Board of Governors of the Federal Reserve System, and also at the Department of State. No doubt the government service which he remembers with greatest fondness, however, is his service with the OSS during World War II. Somehow they don't call you Wild Charlie, but... Now, Professor Kindleberger most recently has written a manual of sound banking practice. Its title is Manias, Panics, and Crashes. And as a part of this manual of sound banking practice, he also gives an injunction to Governor Wallach and other central bankers about how lending, the lender of last resort activity should be carried out, and I thought I would share with you a very brief part of that. Quote, "The lender of last resort should exist, but his presence should be doubted. For example, uncertainty about whether New York City would be helped, and by whom, may have proved just right in the long run, so long as help was finally provided, and so long as there was doubt right to the end as to whether it would be. This is a neat trick. Always come to the rescue in order to prevent needless deflation, but always leave it uncertain whether rescue will arrive in time or at all, so as to instill caution in other speculators, banks, cities, or countries. In Voltaire's Candide, the head of a general was cut off in order to encourage the others. What I am urging is that some sleight of hand, some trick with mirrors be found to encourage the others, without, of course, cutting off actual heads, because fundamentalism has such unhappy consequences for economic systems." Professor Charles Kindleberger.
I was told by Professor Friedman that I was not supposed to talk about 1933. And I said, I have such good stories about that. It was such a happy time when the banks were closed. It was so, everybody felt such release. And I want to talk about my friend who stowed away on the Queen of Bermuda on March 3rd and could only take $4 with him because the other 14 were blocked in the bank. He'd also stowed away at the motorboat show, by the way, which suggests he was a man of great imagination. I want to share with Cooper the view that this is 50th anniversary of the bank holiday is a poor thing to talk about right now, because we're really about 53 years away, or 52 years away from the troubles that seem very relevant to our troubles today. Not sure whether God has 10 fingers and 10 toes, so that we really should believe in the decimal system. I rather like 53 years as a prime number. Better, 1930, 1931. And at that time, instead of worrying about the bank holiday, I was in Geneva in the summer at the School for International Studies, admiring Smith girls. God, it was glorious. Now, I want to talk about the difference between today and those days. The differences are interesting and many. First place, the stock market is not a problem. The stock market was a terrible problem in those days. I agree with Kenneth Galbraith completely, and disagree completely with Milton Friedman, who said it was no worse than a bad cold. That's a reference, by the way, to gonorrhea, which I won't go into, but stock market, really, a lot of banks all over the world had big equity positions. Some of us are really bemused by the fact that the big collapse of banking in the United States started because we all read it in Milton Friedman and Anna Schwartz's book, with the Bank of the United States collapse in December 1930. That isn't true at all. First place, you had the Caldwell Bank, which failed the system all through, from Nashville, headed Nashville, all through the Southeast. That collapsed in November. And by the way, I got a cheap thrill when I saw the United American Bank collapse, sort of 100 miles away, because I sort of said, this is where I came in, very close to it. But more than that, bear in mind that you had bank collapses in Italy, in the Banco Commerciale Italiano and the Credito Italiano in the summer of 1930. But the interesting thing about them is they were kept secret. They were hidden. And they didn't communicate any anxiety or worry. But if you looked at the people in the Bank of Italy and the people in what later became IRI, the Istituto per Ricostruzione Industriale, they were worried. And I go back still further. Before 1929, there was a very interesting rescue of a bank, the William Deacon's Bank, in Scotland, or northern England anyhow. I don't want to be too precise of which side of the border it was on. And the Montague Norman rescued it, but said, this is a secret. And he rescued it in a way that I find extremely interesting. He said, you can maintain your dividend even though you're broke and we're bailing you out, but you cannot raise it. And if any other bank in the United Kingdom lowers its dividend, you must lower yours. That's a sort of cover-up plan. There's a cover-up for you. If you think Nixon covered up, look at Montague Norman as a cover-up artist from way back. Now, our problem today is not this stock market, although one gets questions about it. Our cover-up, our problem is this business of sovereign risk. And I find it interesting that as the speakers proceeded today, they closed down what I had to say. Bit by bit, I would see this chunk lost, this chunk lost, this thing I could say gone, this thing I could say gone. I was hoping that nobody would discuss oil. Thank God I have something left. I can talk about oil. The interesting thing about oil is if the oil price goes down, we have winners and losers. If it goes up, we have winners and losers. And you have to worry about who's the big winner, who's the big loser. There are a good many pundits, some of them from MIT, where we grow pundits with no trouble, in fact. We produce them like crazy. We have a great many pundits who say, don't worry about the price of oil going down. No worse than a bad cold. But I think that the interesting question is what we worry about, those of us who worry about the bank problems, the syndicated bank loans, which are use twice the capital of the American banking, the major banks, in big syndicated bank loans. That Brazil wants the price of coffee, the price of oil to go down, and Mexico wants it to go up. So this notion of having a little recovery, I couldn't agree more with Dick Cooper about that. But if you have recovery that's extensive enough to raise the price of oil, that doesn't help Brazil very much. The problem, by the way, I should go on and say, we talk about the third world particularly. don't forget that a good many of these loans have been made rather freely to the socialist bloc. And today, it's completely clear, but nobody admits it, that Poland is in default. Poland loans, we have a series of words which anybody who's interested in rhetoric would enjoy them very much. There are problem loans, there are loans which are in, there's another word, and then there's default. Default says, is a very slow process, you arrive at it very late, somebody says, I won't pay. And every country wants to avoid that for interesting reasons. I'm not sure that one would have thought that the Soviet bloc would be happy not to pay. On the other hand, they are very unhappy if they reach that point. But the Polish loans today are in default by any reasonable bank examiner standard. But bank examiners don't acknowledge it, and banks don't acknowledge it. So that you have a bank examiner problem here. It's the question of the emperor and his trousers, brilliant trousers. Is Poland, are those loans viable? Of course they are, if you think they are. Now, there are a couple of things I want to say about the FDIC. I think the FDIC made a mistake in increasing the limit to $100,000. One of the things they've done is to subtract, they've weakened the pressure on the banks to lend carefully. I think also what they've done by with the banking system, by moving to floating rate loans, has reduced the problem of the banks suffering from a shift of the rate of interest. The only thing they have left is a credit risk, and we're getting rid of that by never admitting that anybody's broke. So that we do have a serious problem, I think, in worrying about the morality of the whole system. I must say I agree with Cooper that we shouldn't try to punish the banks by the kind of systems that Felix Rohatyn or that Peter Kenneth have produced. At the same time, I find myself unhappy that when they do roll over and lend more, they jack up the rates substantially. The beauty of the Kennan program was that that each bank would say, we've lost already 10% or 20% of our loan, and we have to write that off, and the president then can't smile all the time at the annual meeting. I shouldn't think. Whereas if when the Mexican rollover occurs, Mexico moves up from 1% over LIBOR to 2.5% over LIBOR, then earnings keep up and are kept going. I think that the position right now is one which I called in my book distress. Distress is a passage between euphoria, excitement, overlending, overtrading, as Adam Smith called it. Adam Smith was a great man for rhetoric. He had overtrading followed by revulsion and discredit. You can't get better language than that. But in between overtrading and revulsion, you have what I would call distress. That is, you can contemplate the possibility that you're in deep trouble. And that's where we are now. We're in distress. This word was made up by Myron Gordon, who used it for a corporation. A corporation is in distress when it looks at its balance sheet and says, maybe. And the banking system now is in distress because as it looks ahead, it says maybe. Now, as I've looked at this question historically, the distress sometimes results in a crash or a panic, and sometimes it doesn't. And the way to get out of it is not, I think I agree completely with Cooper, not to have another Bretton Woods or another Constitution writing or another big meeting of the UNCTAD or anything like that, but to nickel and dime yourself back to a solution, to inch your way back. And inching is very hard on the nerves. If he talked about a precipice. I love these metaphors. They're not very mathematical. Today's economics goes in for mathematics, and I'm told that catastrophe mathematics is not a very respectable subject. It deals with cusps. I thought cusps is something that you used to have in old bars and saloons, but the mathematics of catastrophe, I think, are probably beyond the capacity of most of us. But the notion of being in trouble and inching your way back, that I think you can understand, and I hope that's where we're going. But I'm troubled by the notion of the insouciance is the word of a great many bankers of the old days. Walter Wriston, he was recently talked about as a candidate for the Paul Volcker's job, and he modestly said he had a conflict of interest, having been that. The way he talked about country loans, there's never any problem. They can't lay a glove on us. We're home free. Costanza, Wriston, Friedman, that's Irving Friedman, not Milton. The way they talked at a time when everybody else who had any sense, I thought, was saying, be careful, bothers me. And while I am not a vindictive man, I hope, I just don't like to see this thing, I just don't like to see them get that 2.5% over LIBOR. Thank you.
We're now about to open the floor for discussion and questions. There are microphones placed around the audience. I see one or two people have already found them. One over there, and also up on the stairs to the upper level. While people are lining up at the microphone, let me just give the panelists an opportunity to defend their honor extremely briefly if they would like to do so. We'll go in the same order. Ken, would you like to defend yourself?
No, I shall accept all the retributive attacks. But I would like to ask a question. I think we've had not only an amiable but an extraordinarily responsible discussion here this evening. I would like to persuade Kindleberger that the semantics of our time is much more complete than he suggests. We have, in addition to the rolled over loans and the rescheduled loans and the problem loans, the non-performing assets, Charlie.
I was looking for that one. I know that one.
But my more serious question is to both of my colleagues who came up with what I think is, as I say, responsible and important suggestions. Both, however, both Governor Wallach and Professor Cooper were reluctant to talk about a bailout. And both came to this provision that the IMF is insisting on, namely that the banks themselves advance further money. If that further money is advanced to Mexico and Brazil and Argentina, as I hope it will be, and it is used to pay interest back to the banks, if it's not a bailout, wouldn't you say, Henry, that there's a certain narcissistic quality about that operation?
Henry, you're next.
I would just say that after what we've heard about the closing of the banks in 1933, this country is probably better off with its banks open than closed.
Dick? Charlie? Well, let's start with questions. Gentleman in the green sweater.
I have a question. The question is to the panel. Anyone can answer it. When the IMF bailout bill came through, I guess about a week ago, there was an amendment that the U.S. should join the Bank for International Settlements. I don't understand this because it is a private Swiss bank. It's tainted from the Nazi period, repository for a lot of Nazi gold. It was denounced 50 years ago by McFadden. What advantage would there be for the U.S. to join such an institution. How does this fit in? And I guess since Governor Wallach is one of those genus of creatures from Switzerland, he would be the best one to start the panel.
Well, all you say about the BIS I've heard before, but I'm surprised to hear it at Harvard. There's nothing factual about what you say that it's a Nazi institution or that has Nazi goal. It's a very useful institution that has done a great deal recently to avoid a crisis, and the reason for that amendment is to strengthen the setup that in a crisis can go to work quickly and turn out billions for Mexico, Brazil, Argentina, Yugoslavia, and so on. Now, whether the U.S. joins or not actually does not make a great deal of difference. Technically, the U.S. is entitled to take its seat under the statutes of the BIS any day. There are some reasons why this has not been convenient, but actually the cooperation works very well. And I have to say that without the BIS, the recent problems of developing countries would have been a great deal more serious. I don't say that they couldn't have been handled by central banks directly, but it certainly was very helpful to have them involved.
Well, briefly.
Well, all right. I just wondered if anyone else had anything to say about supporting that.
I would like to comment to a certain extent. One of the problems with a bailout operation in a time of crisis is the time. And during 1931, when the French would raise the question about should we help Germany or not, given the legal problems of the Young Plan, it takes 3 weeks to do it. While that 3 weeks debate was going on, Germany went down the tube. You got to move fast. Now, the IMF cannot move fast. The IMF is a lumbering, decision-making body which everybody has to go back. Some have to go back. Directors have to consult 6 governments. They can't decide anything in less than 3 or 4 weeks.
But the BIS in the 30s dragged its feet when the Austrian Credit Anstalt went under, and that was a power play Norman
I beg your
pulled.
pardon. What happened there was that the French dragged their feet and made the BIS drag their feet. But and by the way, if the leading central banks or countries aren't united in trying to solve something, no institution can do it. But what you've had in the last little while is bridging loans, the BIS moving in quickly with some money, something which used to be done with the swap arrangements under of the group of 10 big central banks. But since you're lending now to people who don't belong to the swap arrangements and for whom the swap arrangements have never extended, and for whom you might get the central bank might get badly stuck, you need some international body to take the lead of the IMF, because the IMF is too slow and cumbersome. And the BIS, think of the BIS as a light on his feet quarterback as opposed to a big lumbering fullback.
Okay.
Can we go on? I think we should go on to the next question. Or Dick, were you going to respond to this?
Well, I like Henry Wallach, I don't think it makes a big difference whether the U.S. joins the BIS or not formally. As an actual factual matter, the U.S. cooperates closely with the BIS, and the BIS can step quickly. It won't step typically without the support of the U.S., whether the U.S. is a member or not. I would just say this, that I think it is unfortunate and regrettable to use events of 50 years ago, even if they were right,
which they are,
to hold against a current institution. A current institution, these kinds of institutions do not have an autonomous, independent existence. They exist as a function of their leading members.
With the same crew as in the 30s.
And I think you've asked your question, and I think we're going to let the panel answer it.
And I think U.S. membership, if one is worried about the past of this particular institution, U.S. membership is perhaps one of the best ways to assure that it wouldn't happen again.
Let's go on to the gentleman in the blue sweater.
Yeah, what I would like to ask Mr. Wallach especially is, it seems that the current policy, especially the Federal Reserve and also the Bank of England and the Swiss National Bank, is to actually shove these debtor nations into a corner, and it almost seems that you're pushing them into a situation where they're either going to create a debtors cartel and literally drop the debt bomb on the industrialized nations, or, who knows what else could happen after that. My question is, how are you going to deal with the situation if, like, let's say at the Group of 77 meeting coming up this next week, these people do decide to have so-called collective renegotiation of the debt?
Well, as far as pushing countries into a corner is concerned, I think very substantial credit has been made available, maybe not quite as much as you would like to see, but countries are still able to run large current account surpluses, deficits under the first-year IMF programs. Now, as far as debtors cartel and so on, this is a sensationalist idea which you hear from time to time. There's been one case of a country that walked away from its debt, that was Cuba. There's another case of an African country that for 2 years walked away from its debt. Then came a change in government, and they realized that they were better off maintaining credit and trade relations than cutting themselves off. I think that is the answer that any country that wants to live in this world will give itself. If it doesn't pay, it cuts itself off not only from credit, cuts itself off from technology, it exposes its trade to all kinds of problems. Creditors will take it to court, and wherever any asset of the country shows up, it'll be attached and maybe impounded. I don't know what sovereign governments would do about countries that didn't pay. I don't assume that they'd get very helpful treatment anyway. I don't know of any country that seriously is considering this, although I know that a great deal of oratory goes on for possibly domestic purposes in groups like the G77.
Dick, do you want to say something?
I think that the question was wrongly posed, if I may say so. One can debate endlessly how we got into this situation. There are many possible explanations, many of which have some validity to them. But the practical situation as of right now is that these countries are in serious difficulty, and the IMF, far from aggravating that difficulty, mitigates it. The alternative to not having an IMF program with IMF lending and with resumed bank lending is a more severe program, as Brazil discovered in 1981 when it chose not to go to the IMF. And therefore, I think that somehow the image that the IMF has gotten as the bad guy because it tells countries what they have to do is completely inappropriate. The IMF is actually the rescuer in the present circumstances. And the practical questions revolve around that delicate combination of how much retrenchment the country does and how much credit the IMF itself gives and persuades the banks to give. My own judgment is, in the current world economic situation, is that the IMF ought to be predisposed toward somewhat less retrenchment and somewhat more credit. But that's a marginal judgment. It's not a question of fundamentals. And of course, to do that, the IMF has to have additional resources. It does not have enough resources at the present time. But I think the world would be better off that there's somewhat less retrenchment in the Mexicos, the Brazils, the Philippines of the world, rather than more. But that's where the practical trade-off is, between slightly less retrenchment and slightly more credit, or the other way around. And in fact, the IMF on the whole is a helper in the present situation, not something that makes the situation worse.
I'm informed we have time for only one last question. There's a gentleman in the first balcony up there.
The members of the panel have mentioned the need for flexibility and the uncertainty of economic forecasting. I'd like to ask, on the one hand, how the banking system might respond if the drop in the price of oil goes much further than expected. Say it goes down to $20 a barrel, Or on the other hand, if we get back to the inflation of 1979 and 80, would wage and price controls come in there? How would we react to either extreme?
Charlie, do you want to?
Well, I think the problem is what happens to the price of oil determines which countries are in the forefront of the queue to have their problems addressed by the Paris Club and by the IMF. Some like Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, Abu Dhabi, and the Arab Emirate states have cash, but a great many other countries, oil producers, including Mexico and Nigeria and Algeria and so on, use the high price of oil to take on programs which are much too ambitious. That's the story of a lot of people over a lot of years. It's by no means new. And the further the price of oil goes down, the worse they are. On the other hand, the Mexicos, the Brazils, and a number of other countries, Argentina, Chile, and so on, would welcome the reprieve which that price. And there are people now spending their time making a living calculating what happens to the given country's balance of payments, depending on whether the price of oil goes up or down $1, or $2, or $3. So that you have a good question. But I don't think the answer, I would hope that the answer as to what happens to the price of oil is not determined by which countries are affected this way. We have an oil problem, too. And it's an oil problem that we need to get sort of settled out, get the price of oil with some move slowly to some long-run steady position.
We're out of time, I'm sorry to say, so in behalf of Bob Dorfman and myself, I want to thank Dean Allison and the Kennedy School for hosting this event. I'd like to thank our 4 panelists for giving us their remarks, and finally all of you for participating. Thank you very much.